Welcome to Sales Accelerators, Winning Strategies for Financial Professionals, an educational webinar series that explores the latest tools and concepts to help boost your sales performance and drive business growth. Join us as we analyze trending topics in life insurance, investigate the latest headlines, and discuss solutions to accommodate your clients' unique needs. Please welcome your host, Kurt Fasen, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing.
Hello, welcome again to another edition of Sales Accelerators, the webinar series where we deliver quick and practical insights to put you to work right away. Now, in today's session, we're going to be geared more towards how to serve one of the most influential and underserved markets in financial planning. It's women. With women controlling the majority of the purchasing power and holding significant generational wealth, the opportunity to support their financial future really has never been greater. Now, to help us in this conversation, I'm excited to welcome Ann Hagerty, Director of Advanced Sales at Securian Financial. Ann, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so for those of you that are new to our podcast and webcast, I want to just take a moment to remind you of something we call our webinar action plan. And it's as simple as this. As Ann and I are talking today, I want you to jot down clients, make a couple notes, or if Ann mentions a scenario that something pops in your mind that perhaps could be of value to a specific client or a situation, perhaps somebody you've been talking to, write it down. And after the program, I encourage you to follow up with our team and let us help you think of ways of how we can help you help your clients. All right, let's take this forward. To kick things off, I'd love to touch on why this topic matters. Now, first, you should know DBS has really prioritized supporting women in recent years, and it's great to see Securian Financial doing the same thing. Now, from your perspective, Ann, why is it so important to empower women to take charge of their future, protect what matters, and build a lasting legacy? And why is the timing critical to have the conversation right now?
Yeah, Kurt, thanks for that question. It's a great one. Here at Securian Financial, we're dedicated to believing that women have the potential to be our best clients, right? Because when we think about women, women have a backup plan for their backup plan, right? And so we want to bring them into the conversation. They also possess a majority of the purchasing power. So one of the jokes I always tell is, where do all those Amazon boxes come from? And as you can see here, almost 85% of women either assume control or share control over their family finances. So we know that women are a part of that. We also know that women are loyal customers, right? So 40% of women will likely follow their financial professional to another firm. And lastly, 70% of women are likely to recommend their financial professional to a relative or friend. So that's very important. And then looking at kind of the situation that women find themselves in, right? Women have a longer life expectancy than men, which means their money needs to last longer. And that's important because women born in North America in 2023 are expected to live 6 years longer than men born in the same year. Wow. This creates a need for more lifetime income, as well as considerations around potential long-term care needs. So it's really, really important to plan now and help reduce financial stress in future years. And then finally, at some point throughout life, most women will take on the role of a primary caregiver. So I know a lot of us, especially in my generation, are in that sandwich generation, right? Where you're caring for both mom and dad potentially, and also a caregiver to your own children. So when we look at those numbers, more than 75% of caregivers are women. And at some point, you may provide care for aging parents or relatives, as I just said, while at the same time caring for your own children. And providing this unpaid care often forces individuals, especially women, to reduce work hours or leave the workforce entirely or limit their future earnings in some capacity, and it diminishes their future retirement savings. And we just heard about how they live longer, I need more retirement savings. So it can definitely be a burden on the family. So women need to kind of make up the gap in terms of offsetting the care that they give in these settings.
That makes total sense. And when you walk through each piece there, it really drives home the criticality, the true importance of bringing this conversation to women. And there's clearly a difference in the concerns and planning needs between men and women, and there's a very real and valid factor in how women approach their financial futures. And on top of that, I believe that you'd also say that there's a real wealth dynamic at play here as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would agree, definitely. As you know, and many folks have talked about, we're in the midst of already a historic generational wealth transfer, and women are really at the center of that. So I think, when we think about this generational wealth transfer, we sort of think this will be sometime in the future, but it's happening now, right? And so by 2030, which isn't that far away, if you imagine how fast time is going already, women are expected to control 38% of total assets. Because they live longer, they're the first inheritors of that generational wealth transfer, and an estimated $34 trillion will be in their hands. And this shift really means that more women are not just inheriting wealth, right? They're becoming key decision makers and wealth managers. And that's especially important for financial professionals. So when you look at kind of the current opportunity, an estimated 53% of assets controlled by women are currently unmanaged versus 45% of assets controlled by men. So still quite a lot in terms of looking at opportunities, clients that need help from financial professionals, and bringing these managed assets to women at their level. Having these conversations brings about a big opportunity for financial professionals.
It really is. And, it's clearly a huge opportunity to focus on women. But let's talk about the current environment.
Yep.
The current environment also plays a role, and I think we're in a unique timing standpoint from a planning perspective.
Yep. I think right now is a historic time in terms of kind of the tax scenarios that we're in. And, we're not operating from a fear-based planning perspective. We're really operating from an open floor plan. And what I mean by that is you have this large federal exemption. It's $15 million per person or $30 million if you're married. And what that looks like is essentially, if you die or give away during your lifetime, $15 million or 30 if you're married, you don't have a federal estate tax. So that allows people to do a lot of gift planning and other things that they can control today. And then if you look at that going forward, it's supposed to adjust for inflation annually. So that number is only going to become larger and present more opportunities. I will just also call out that we are in a historically low income tax environment at the same time. So in theory, large gifting capacity, but also more money in our pockets potentially, right? Yeah. We also have 16 states that do have a estate or inheritance tax. So there's still certainly a need for that type of tax planning depending on where you live. So we live in Minnesota, right, where there is an estate tax in Minnesota. And so folks in Minnesota have to do that planning with an estate planner and think about how they utilize their exemption at death and what happens, at first death and second death, and what kids are left with in terms of taxes. So that's a pretty important conversation. And again, those 16 states, there's opportunities there to have those conversations now. And when I was an estate planner here in Minnesota, that was very, very common that we would work with clients on creating those scenarios and using that Minnesota exemption first, and then planning for the surviving spouse and making sure they were taken care of, but also that tax bill was addressed. And finally, we talked a little bit about gifting. That you have this large capacity for gifting. But sometimes one of the reasons why life insurance works so well in terms of estate planning is when you gift an asset, the recipient receives that carryover basis, meaning they inherit what you paid for the house. So, if I decide I like Kurt and I want to give him my house, but I only paid $100,000 for it, I give it to Kurt while I'm alive, he has to keep that $100,000 basis. So if Kurt decides to sell that house, he's got to pay capital gains. Where if I leave that house to him at death, he gets a step up in basis, meaning he gets the date of death value and therefore is unlikely to have capital gains issues. So when you're thinking about gifting, often, gifting premiums of cash to life insurance can be a really nice way to leverage those gifting, that large gifting capacity.
Well, and that's great. And as I think about it, you really have three buckets, right? You've got your federal estate tax and 15 to 30 million. That's a lot of money, but it is going to impact people in a real meaningful way. So thoughtful planning has to happen. But then we have those 16 states, which you reminded me, we're in one of them, that is going to require another level of planning. And then one of the planning techniques many times is gifting. And if we don't take the right steps in doing the planning, an unintended consequence could happen and really not solve the way we're hoping to solve for. So I know as we're preparing, you talked about a scenario with a woman who is married, has some kiddos, and is a stay-at-home mom. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that situation and how this might be, folks, an opportunity for each one of you to be thinking about who do you know that's like Heather.
Yep, absolutely. I think Heather is a great example of both, women that are stay-at-home mothers or maybe work part-time and, their spouse is the primary earner. And so that's what's important here is to think about, who this woman is and what are her concerns. So right off the bat, we know that this woman is probably managing full-time activity manager, right? Managing all of the sports, meals, everything that's happening in the household. And what we know about that woman is she really cares about her family. And so a great way to have a conversation with a woman like this is, what happens if something happens to you? What happens if something happens to your spouse? And getting her into that estate planning mindset and conversation so that she's able to think about what the needs are if something were to happen. I know that nobody wants to think like that, but we know that you have peace of mind when you have a plan. And so she certainly needs coverage for wealth replacement if something happened to her spouse. And because her spouse is a high earner, they have a possible estate tax issue. Maybe it's federal, maybe it's in the state that they live in, but the thing is they're younger, right? And they're not ready to lose control of their assets. So it's very important to them that whatever estate plan they put in place, they have access to those assets and have some flexibility within that estate plan. And I think in general right now, flexibility is key with estate planning. So these are also great tools and conversations to have with clients that are in different circumstances as well, but really identifying those young families. So one thing that we use often here in Minnesota is called a credit shelter trust. It can sometimes be called an AB or a bypass trust, but essentially it's created via a normal estate plan. So all your client needs is to have an estate plan, whether that's a last will and testament or revocable living trust. And they have language that says this credit shelter trust is created at the first death of the first spouse. So a little caveat, in order to do this type of planning, you need to be married because you're essentially using both spouses in order to create this type of plan. So once assets get into the credit shelter trust, they're held apart from the estate of their surviving spouse. And what's nice about that, like in Minnesota, you want to use the exemption that you have available and fund that credit shelter trust at first death. Then anything else goes to the surviving spouse and they have full access. But what's special about the credit shelter trust is the surviving spouse still has access to that for health, education, maintenance, and support, oftentimes called HEMS powers. And what that does is it offers them the flexibility of having an estate plan. So they have a plan in place. They have a plan if they have a tax problem, but they also can access assets in the credit shelter trust if needed, right? But that's not necessarily the plan, but it gives them that flexibility and that control that if they do need access, they have access. And the beneficiaries ultimately in this case typically would be the children. And the goal is for them to leave the assets to them income and estate tax free through this credit shelter trust planning.
Yeah, that's great. And as I mentioned to you, and this case hits home because I've got two married daughters that are within a year or two on either side of that number. And you're so right. They're both stay-at-home moms, and they're both working to run the chaos in the family, if you will. And having that flexibility is so important as we go forward. But what about two policies? I assume this would work with two policies as well. How would that be structured?
Yep. So this is really looking at, how does money fund that credit shelter trust? We just talked about, why gifting can be tough. So if I decide to gift assets to a trust, I have that same problem I had before with the carryover basis. And so why we want to use life insurance in these plans is because it's a really nice mechanism for funding future estate taxes, for funding future wealth and generational wealth transfer. So in this type of case, we're going to utilize that credit shelter trust that I described earlier. So we have the husband, he has a policy on his wife, and the wife has a policy on her husband. So this is considered a cross-owned policy scenario. And you have that revocable living trust, or you have that last will and testament. And that document is going to contain credit shelter trust language. So it's going to say at first death, we're going to fund some of the assets into the credit shelter trust. We're very specifically going to use life insurance in that scenario. So why are we doing it this way? So what happens in this case, we have the husband die, okay? And when he passes away, essentially, what do we know about the wife? She has a policy on her husband, right? So she's going to receive the death benefit for wealth replacement. So in this case, say it's Heather, she's fine now, right? She has all of the assets that she needs to continue her lifestyle, take care of the kids, send them to college. But we also have this other policy out there, and that's her husband Brett's policy, and that's on her life. And what do we know about the policy now? It's in force, right? Because she's still alive. So what happens then is that policy drops into the credit shelter trust. That continues to accumulate, but it's outside of her estate. So it's going to go income and estate tax free through that credit shelter trust. But if Heather gets in a bind, she has access to the credit shelter trust for those HEMS provisions, health, education, maintenance, and support. So looking closer at this, we have the policy Brett owns on Heather and vice versa. We funded it with an initial $500,000 face amount. And then in, future state, whenever Brett passes away, Heather receives a death benefit. In this example, he dies at an older age, so he's 80, and she has wealth replacement of $5.3 million because they funded these policies while they were so young. Brett's policy on Heather goes into that credit shelter trust. And again, she has access to $4.1 million of cash value, and the remaining death benefit, if she never utilizes that cash value, goes right to the children. So for a younger couple, you're usually going to focus on an accumulation focused life insurance policy to both allow it to grow, drive up that death benefit. But if she does need access through the credit shelter trust, we have some cash value there.
Yeah, and for those of you that are watching, listening to this, this is not that difficult. This is actually a very common planning approach. When I was in the field, we use this with our clients. This is a very common planning approach, and one that we can help you with along the way. But I'm sure some people are thinking, well, great, but maybe that two policies are going to cost too much. So maybe we could just go with a single policy. How would that work, Ann?
Yep, absolutely. And I think that can be difficult with young families. They're, paying for hockey and gymnastics and all kinds of fun things, and maybe don't feel ready to afford, two permanent policies at that point. So this honestly works better, or best, I should say, with a couple that maybe has somewhat of an age gap. So if you have one spouse that's younger and one spouse that's older, you sort of start with somebody that's maybe mortality inferior. So that's essentially what you would do in a one policy approach, is you're kind of doing the planning based on who you think is going to pass away first, which again is sort of morbid, but that's the life we live and the work that we do. But it does offer a more affordable estate plan. And so in this case, Heather and Brett are going to own a survivorship policy, and they're going to pay $13,000 for 20 years for this policy. So what happens when Brett passes away at 80? The policy moves into the credit shelter trust. Heather has access to the cash value of $3.4 million, but remember that policy has not paid out yet because it's a second to die policy where Heather has to pass away for it ultimately to go to the kids. And so the reason people do this generally is they know they have some kind of estate tax concern or will have some kind of estate tax concern, but are less concerned with that wealth replacement aspect at first death and more concerned with moving assets out of their estate. So when Heather dies at 85, the kids receive a death benefit of $5.9 million, potentially to pay off any estate taxes and continue their generational wealth. So there are a number of ways to actually use a one policy approach. So, more than happy to work with you on those types of cases as well, because it's really what fits best for the client. And you do want to address wealth replacement, certainly for a family like this.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe we could talk just a little bit about, maybe first define what a SLAT is, and then help us understand why that could be utilized in planning for a couple like this.
Yep. So if we look at Heather and Brett, we tick them up a notch. Maybe they're a little bit older and maybe they've accumulated a little more wealth and they feel a little more comfortable kind of separating from assets. So in our first example, using wait and see planning, the entire time that they own those policies, they had full access to them. It was only until one of them passed away that we kind of started that planning process. So with the SLAT, I like to call a SLAT a fancy eyelet. It's just an eyelet where you give access via that eyelet to your spouse. And so what's really important is that one spouse sets it up and the beneficiaries are going to be the non-grantor spouse, the spouse that didn't set up the trust, and then those children. So in this example, let's say Brett's a doctor. Let's say he's a surgeon. He has accumulated quite a lot of money and feels comfortable gifting some of the assets into a SLAT for Heather and the kids. And it's really important that Brett uses his own isolated funds to gift premiums to that life insurance policy that's going to be owned by the SLAT. He's going to do this both for asset protection in case he were to be sued. The money inside that SLAT is protected and they can't come after him personally for that. And then secondary, he can do some tax planning and estate planning where he's providing both for Heather and the kids. So the policy is owned by the SLAT, as I said, and then Brett's the insured with Heather and the kids as beneficiaries. So while they're both alive, actually Heather has access to the SLAT and that policy inside the SLAT for those same provisions: health, education, maintenance, and support. And so by the time she's 65, she has access to $1.6 million. But when Brett passes away, the death benefit of $3 million will go outside of his estate and be income and estate tax free to Heather and the kids. So any remaining assets essentially pass to children outside of the estate after Heather dies if she never utilizes those HEMS provisions as well. So really, I would say on the ticker of flexibility, you have wait and see as being most flexible. This is kind of secondary flexibility. That's why you're seeing a lot of SLAT planning right now, because people don't have the fear of a low federal exemption, but they also want to make sure they're able to address that now rather than waiting till they realize that they have a problem. So a really nice plan if you're comfortable doing some gifting.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to change the scenario up a little bit if I can. And let's move to a woman who might be divorced, blended families. How does that scenario change things?
Yep, absolutely. We have another example of this. I know we're kind of limited on time today, but I do think blended families in itself could be its own conversation, right? We could do a webinar just on that topic because it is so important. When you have divorce involved and families that are blended, you have even a greater complexity of the planning that you might do. And specifically when you're working with women in blended families, the opportunity really centers on that control, clarity, fairness, kind of thinking about, your new relationship, their children, your children, and how all of that blends together. And so what happens is many of these women are balancing a desire to support that current spouse while also protecting the legacy for children from a prior relationship. So this is quite common. And one of the difficulties about all of this type of planning is asking those difficult questions, right? Having the conversation, if something happens to you, do your assets go to your kids or do they go to your new spouse? And sometimes that can be a difficult conversation, especially when you think about qualified assets and how nicely and seamlessly they pass between spouses versus how they pass to children. Life insurance, specifically with ILIT planning or an irrevocable life insurance trust, can be a nice balance for a woman who would prefer to leave maybe those qualified assets or even their home to their current spouse, but then want to have a plan for what they leave to the children. Kind of a tax efficient legacy type of play. They can create that tax efficiency using life insurance inside an irrevocable trust that then won't go to their current spouse or their children, but be specifically set aside for their children from their first relationship. And I think that's really important.
Well, that's fantastic, and I agree. Maybe I'll take you up on that, Ann. We'll do a separate session just on blended families. All right, let's go to another scenario, and I think we've touched on this earlier. I know we have on some of my prior webcasts. We hear the statistic that 70% of widows will part ways with their financial professional. And even if they worked with them as a couple and all of that, and it means not moving just their assets, but also the inherited assets. And that's just a powerful reminder, and probably one that many of you that are watching and listening have heard for many, many times. But with that in mind, and can you talk maybe about the planning with widows and what financial professionals really should be thinking about, perhaps to avoid this outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to including the woman in the conversation, like we're doing here in these previous scenarios, saying what matters to you, what do you want this to look like? I think that's a big piece of it kind of at the beginning and making sure the relationship is with both people. But I think when you think about widows specifically, they have other penalties and tax concerns that they didn't previously have when they're married. So let's take a look at what life is like for a widow. So we'll take a look at Claudia, and we're gonna assume that Claudia and her spouse had an estate plan and everything worked seamlessly because of the financial professional's help, right? And so that's why Claudia is sticking around with you and making sure to continue to work with you. But Claudia anticipates high income during retirement because she's an executive. She has a pension as well as other sources of income, and she wants to maintain kind of her current lifestyle, right? So she's an affluent client. But what she knows is the higher the taxes, especially now that she's filing single, she has to worry about the increased tax bill, but she also potentially has to worry about the cost of healthcare. She also is an independent woman, right, who knows that her kids have successful careers, but she's concerned about how she's going to take care of herself if she has a long-term care event or a health concern, knowing her kids aren't going to be able to drop their current careers to take care of her, and nor does she want them to. Like most clients, they want to have that full independence. So in addition to, increased distributions, increased taxation, we also have to understand IRMA. So that's the income related monthly adjustment amount. Some people call it Aunt Irma comes to get you. It's just about how much IRMA can cost. So if we look at this trajectory of, the income tax thresholds, we see for somebody who's married filing an individual return at just $500,000 or more of income, the estimated monthly cost of the Medicare premiums go up to $761. So that's quite significant from the baseline amount of $231. And over time, over a number of years, over even a single 12-month year, that can add up to quite a lot. And so it's just important to understand that when you have higher income, when you're a single filer, some of these additional costs known as the widow's penalty can impact women specifically. And then taking a look at an example of what this looks like. So say we have Claudia, back when she was 60, she told her financial professional about her concerns with long-term care, but say they looked at her portfolio and they decided, it doesn't matter. I think I have enough money to pay directly or self-fund my long-term care cost. So by the time she's 85, she's now chronically ill and needs in-home care. So a lot of our affluent clients are going to want to first at least have care in the home, and want to try to self-fund that. So she needs another $80,000 for care, plus she has $80,000 for her normal income or her normal taxable income, which brings her to a taxable income of $160,000. Okay, so paying for both of these things is pretty significant. She's now got a federal tax liability of almost $30,000, plus she's additional IRMA surcharges of $2,600. Now, just in that single year of paying for care, she's got a $30,291 total tax and IRMA surcharge. And that's quite significant because, as we know, a long-term care event doesn't usually just happen in 1 year. It's going to happen over the course of a number of years. And you might be thinking about that, deduction for medical expenses. The medical expense deduction really only applies of medical expenses 7.5% over your adjusted gross income, which does include those additional distributions. And so, that often isn't a viable way to offset our distributions for medical expenses, and home health often doesn't qualify either. And so it's important to kind of think about what a single event of paying out of pocket for medical expenses can do. So looking at, if she bought some kind of long-term care coverage, in this case, we have her in a hybrid linked benefit life and long-term care contract that she paid, $25,000 a year for 7 years when she was 60. And then we take a look at what that benefit looks like when Claudia has a long-term care event and what that does to her taxes and IRMA surcharges. So in the previous example, we had $160,000 of taxable income, total tax of $30,000 or a little over $30,000. And for the tax-free benefit that she has now, she has an annual benefit of $188,000 to cover any long-term care costs that she has. She doesn't even have to utilize that all in that single year. It's an indemnity benefit, so it's completely tax-free. So in that scenario, now her regular taxable income of $80,000 gives her a federal tax liability of a little over $9,000. No IRMA surcharges, no additional costs related to Medicare, and saves her just in that year $21,000. So very significant savings with that coverage.
Boy, that's substantial. And when you really think about it, it doesn't take very long before that starts to make a lot of sense for your clients. Today you've shared some just fabulous ideas, and I'm sure given both myself and our listeners and our viewers a lot to think about when thinking about working with women. Before we wrap up, maybe you could share some general tips for financial professionals on how they could better engage and support women in the overall planning process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, this is a great opportunity when you're thinking about working with women, is not to focus on the product, but on what that peace of mind is that you're bringing, right? So you're looking at what is provided to them before you start with the product. So in Heather's case, maybe she says, I just want peace of mind. If something happens to Brett, that I'll be okay, right? And then maybe that's when you have the life insurance conversation, but you don't have the conversation just starting with the product. And so that's really important. It's also really important to educate and advise these clients, be a trusted resource. You really want them, if something happens to their spouse, to say, I can call Kurt and he will help me out. You want to be a friend, you want to be a trusted resource and a guide kind of through life's ups and downs. So that's really important, which brings me to focusing on life stages, looking at what season of life this person is in, what challenges are they currently facing, and what are they able to tackle today, right? We might have long-term goals that we look at later. A good example might be almost like an after visit summary. You go to the doctor and you get a summary of, here's what's going on with you now, and here's some things you might think about in the future. And so that's a really nice way to focus on your life stage now and then where you might be going in the future. And then help prepare for the unexpected, right? So you want that person that you're working with as a financial professional to feel like they have peace of mind. Like, everything is going well and they can get that cup of coffee and they don't have to worry. And, they really have a strategy for kind of all the ups and downs of life as they kind of climb the mountain that they're on. And so helping them prepare for those unexpected events.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I mean, everything's going well until it isn't. And so preparing for those for the unexpected. That's what you all do. That's
Yeah.
what all of you are doing every single day. And all right, Ann, I'm going to give you a moment just to catch your breath. And I'm just going to remind folks, we have a lot of resources at DBS. We have a website dedicated just working with women. And as I said earlier, we have really been leaning into this space. And so I think you'll find out there's some interesting information, some concepts that focus just on working with women, how to connect with their clients. And we also have some study groups. They're elite study groups. So if you want, and they just focus on women, the women's market. So if you're interested, you should talk to your regional sales director and ask them how you could get access to one of those study groups coming up. And any final words for our audience today?
Yeah, I just also wanted to call out that Securian Financial also has a website, securian.com/ownit, that talks about some of the resources for women and how to start those conversations as a financial professional, things to think about, as well as our advanced sales team. So I lead our team of attorneys and advanced case designers who are here for you as well to work through some of these complex cases. So happy to chat with you in support of DBS. So thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us. And thank you to each one of you out there that took time out of your busy schedule to join us again for another edition of Sales Accelerators. We look forward to talking to you very soon. Don't forget, look at your web action plan and call us up. We're happy to talk to you about whatever cases or ideas that popped in your mind as Ann and I were having our conversation today. Until next time, we look forward to seeing you soon. Be well and stay safe, everyone.